Another course of action is that this is a black flag operation by Putin to slyly reposition the Wagner Group into Belarus.
Welcome back. I am here again with one of our most treasured guests, Dr. Sean McFate. Now, I've talked to Sean in the past, and I haven't done an episode on geopolitics for a while, but I want to emphasize how lucky we are to have Sean here. He is the foremost expert on mercenaries in the English-speaking world. He has contacts at Wagner. And today we're going to talk about what the media is kind of glossing over and hasn't really talked about that much, which is what the heck happened with this Wagnerian rebellion in Russia in the past week and a half. And Sean's going to kind of give us a little background about what happened for folks living under a turnip truck. And then we'll spend much of the episode talking about broader implications, which, spoiler alert, are not very rosy. So, Sean, welcome back, my friend.
Well,
what happened?
It's great to see you. Yeah, I mean, of course, this always happens when I'm on a family vacation. Last time I was on family vacation, some Colombian mercenaries assassinated the president of Haiti about 2 or 3 years ago. So I don't know. It's just the way it goes. But so here's what happened.
And the last thing I didn't say that I should have said. You were also a private military contractor for many years, so you know this industry inside and out. So,
I'm a former insider, which is how I know Wagner Group guys, because they contact me as somebody from that world. So, like you was in the U.S. Army, I was a paratrooper, and then I sort of went to the dark side, as I said, and became a contractor initially for the U.S. government, doing sort of special operations stuff and CIA type stuff in Africa, and was shocked to find out that the U.S. government was outsourcing a lot of that stuff. And this was 20 years ago. And then I went freelance, mostly in Africa, because that's where most of the conflicts are. And then I had a moment of as I would say, come to Jesus moment, realizing that there's a lot of not just moral issues with this, but that there weren't a lot of old people in my industry. So I got out of it, went to graduate school, but I've kept in touch. And my mission really has been to pull back the curtain on the scary world of mercenaries. It's a lot more dangerous and scarier than people think. And the past week and a half of Wagner Group staging a mutiny against Moscow is an example of this. In fact, it's something I predicted 10 years ago in my book, The Modern Mercenary. So anyway, what happened? So as we know, Russia has been waging a war in Ukraine. And the second best army in Ukraine is the Wagner Group. The third best is the Russian army. The Wagner Group is a Russian mercenary outfit. It sort of came on the scene in the Ukraine War of 2014. It was started by a colonel who was retired from Russian Special Forces, or Spetsnaz. His name was Dmitry Utkin, who by all accounts is a very good commander and a neo-Nazi, hence the term Wagner Group, which is after the Russian composer Richard Wagner. He died in the 1870s, 80s, but he was an inspiration for the Nazis. But they became, the Wagner Group in the wars between 2014 and now became Russia's weapon of choice. Anytime Russia wanted to do something that was like super risky and super dangerous in places like Syria, throughout Africa, they didn't send Russian special forces or Russian troops because it would be, too blatant. And if they got in trouble, they couldn't disavow them. Using special forces mercenaries, they could easily disavow them. So one of the chief selling points of Russia of mercenaries is they give good plausible deniability. Another chief selling point is that it allows people like Putin to skirt international law because mercenaries don't give a damn about international law or human rights abuse. In fact, that's one of the things that they do. And the third reason why Putin has relied so heavily on mercenaries like the Wagner Group is because, Russians, just like Americans, hate to see Russian soldiers coming home in body bags, but they don't care about dead contractors or dead mercenaries. So it allows, Putin, it lowers the barriers of entry to conflict for Putin because, even though he's an autocrat, he still has a domestic base to please. And, by outsourcing the war to contractors, the public doesn't really care if they lose a lot of them. So for these three reasons, Russia has been increasingly dependent on the Wagner Group. Now, the Wagner Group has expanded from like 10,000 mercenaries to like 40 or 50,000 mercenaries in the past year, because the war in Ukraine wasn't over in 4 days, just like all the people in Moscow thought, and all the experts on CNN and Fox News thought. It lasted a long time. So they had to, empty jails and stuff like that to fill the Wagner Group. But then there began this rift between Prigozhin, who's the oligarch who finances the Wagner Group and is in Putin's inner circle, and what they call the Siloviki. Now, the Siloviki are like the elites in the Russian security forces, the generals, the head of the intelligence, SVR, the GRU. I mean, all the heads of the national security establishment of Russia, they are called the Siloviki. And this rivalry started like as soon as March of 2022 and became very bitter, which is not a surprise. This is as old as mercenary warfare itself. And mercenaries are the second oldest profession. There's always been a rift historically between knights and mercenaries, professional soldiers and mercenaries. And the reason is because we think of soldiers like wives and mercenaries like prostitutes who turn the service, the honor, the duty, and the love on its head and turn it into a transaction. And that's exactly what happened in the past year in Russia, that you had the Siloviki trying to sabotage Wagner and Prigozhin and vice versa. And Putin was trying to play them off each other, because this is the management style of his hero, Joseph Stalin, who often play generals and rivals off each other and manage through that chaos. Well, this rivalry between Prigozhin, the owner of the Wagner Group, and the Siloviki started to get really out of hand in public starting in January of 2023. And it kept on going. And we don't know if Putin allowed it or he couldn't control it. But as of mid-June in 2023, we know that Prigozhin and the Wagner Group rebelled. Now, the reason they rebelled and they marched on Moscow, and let me remind everybody, the last two guys to march on Moscow were Hitler and Napoleon. So not a small deal. The trigger event for this is that Shoigu, who's the Minister of Defense for Russia,
corrupt, incompetent, but
yeah. I mean, it's funny if you read Prigozhin's Telegram channel, he just calls all these like Garamasa and Shoigu, these fat old generals sitting behind wood desks, sending men to die like it's Stalingrad. And Prigozhin's not wrong. Prigozhin, right. Let's face it. And so, anyway, Shoigu tries to nationalize the Wagner Group, just like, if a country like Nigeria tries to nationalize, ExxonMobil's oil rigs. And he says, he says that, by the end of June, Wagner Group is going to have to be part of the Russian army under my command or else be arrested. And of course, this would leave Prigozhin in the wind. Without an army, he's nothing. And a lot of, people in the Wagner Group don't want to work. They didn't sign up to be in the Russian army. They could have done that. They didn't want to do that. There's a lot of reasons you don't want to be in the Russian army and sent to Ukraine. So because of all this, because this deadline, join the army or else, Prigozhin was in a window as he had to act or get sort of cut out. So he and the Wagner Group, it was July, I don't know what it was, 15, I don't know. I mean, June 15, I don't know when it was, but it was like 8 days ago. They unannounced went to Rostock, which is the headquarters of the Russian military command that was in charge of Ukrainian war. And they took over the entire city. They took over the headquarters. They took over the airport. And then they marched to Moscow. They convoyed to Moscow. And they met surprisingly little resistance, showing that a lot of Russian rank and file in the army don't really want to get involved. It also demonstrates the Potemkin village of Putin's sort of coup-proofness around the Kremlin. And Putin did send Russian aviation to assassinate Prigozhin, and the Wagner Group shot them down. I think they killed like 23 pilots or aviator crews. And then
what did they send against them? Fixed wing or rotary wing?
I don't know. There's been confusion. I assume it's rotary wing, like Mi-24 Heinz or something like that, but it could have been fixed wing. But all we know is that, there's conflicting reports because all sides put out disinformation. The Kremlin puts out lots of disinformation, but Wagner also, Prigozhin doesn't just own the Wagner Group. He also owns the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, aka the Troll Factory. And so, and also Kiev is a huge disinformation provider too. So all these people are providing disinformation. So, anybody who quotes the Ministry of Defense from Kiev or the Ministry of Defense from Moscow, you should just instantly take it with some skepticism or anything Prigozhin has to say. So it's hard to triangulate the truth on this stuff.
What have you heard that they shot these aviation assets down with? Because that's another source of...
I don't know. Surface air missiles.
So again,
I don't know.
I can't verify this. I have no idea because I heard it like second or third hand. But
yeah, I don't know either. There's so much disinformation in the space, especially about details.
One report was it was Stingers that were captured from Ukraine.
Could have been,
which were provided by the U.S.
Again,
no idea if that's true.
Well, we gave them a lot of stuff, and people have to remember that the way Ukraine has been portrayed by the media in the United States is that they are a force of good that could do no wrong. But we can't forget that, Ukraine is as corrupt as, Russia, with their own oligarchs. And I refer to it as Nigeria with snow. It's a corrupt place. And the accountability of all the weapons and money we've given them is an open question. And it's a reason why some members of Congress really want to put the leash on what we're giving and sending over there. So it wouldn't surprise me if they used American-made Stingers to shoot these aircraft down, but I have no verification of this.
Okay. Sorry, continue.
So anyway, what we know is, here's what we know. It's like a black box. We see what goes into the box, what comes out of the box. We can only speculate in the box. Is in the armored convoy to Moscow, Prigozhin and Putin were on the phone hastily negotiating. Now, we don't know what the deal was, but we do know that Prigozhin stopped. He agreed to go and take the Wagner Group with him to Belarus, which is a puppet of Putin. And they have a common narrative that Putin can't be seen as, about to, vulnerable to a coup d'etat. So they both sort of said nothing to see here, but there has been a lot of erroneous commentary in the American press for reasons which I can get into about that Putin won this thing. It's not. It's simply a pause. And people have been saying all week that Putin is winning, is won this, Prigozhin's going to be dead, blah, blah, blah. But I'll tell you what, until the Wagner Group lays down its arms en masse and joins the Russian military, nothing is over. And the deadline for that is today. Today is Saturday, July 1st. So by the end of today or by tomorrow, we'll see what happens. Now, so all this expert commentary reminds me of all the expert commentary when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and all these retired, generals and CIA people and think tankers. Oh, Russia's going to, trounce Ukraine in 3 days. And here we are in a stalemate, a year and a half later, practically. So it's just another example of how the expert class in Washington is not so expert.
So one thing you said that I hadn't heard yet, because there's been so much confusion. I had certainly heard that Prigozhin was getting quote unquote exiled to Belarus, but I hadn't heard that all of the Wagner Group was getting sent to Belarus as well. So one thing that, again, a question I asked myself was, this thing happened with minimal blood loss. It happened so fast. And you are the expert on sneaky war in addition to Mercenaries. What are the chances that this was an elaborate ruse to reposition the Wagner Group into Belarus to open up a second planned offensive or front in the north against Ukraine after the Ukrainian military exhausts itself on the current counteroffensive, which is actually not going very well?
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, what are the chances of that? Is that even a remote possibility?
No, it's a chance. As you remember, Sean, we used to, in the Army, we'd call it a course of action, a COA.
Exactly.
Which for viewers is like a strategic approach. So let's examine all the possible COAs right now as of 1st of July. So one course of action, first of all, like I said, nothing is over. It's just on pause. Okay. And the indicator that Putin won is that the Wagner Group lays everything down, all their weapons, joins the Russian military, and Prigozhin either is killed or disappears. So, okay, that's one course of action. That's what people expect is happening. I disagree with that. Another course of action is that this is a black flag operation by Putin to slyly reposition the Wagner Group into Belarus, which is in north and northwest of Ukraine, and the president Lukashenko, who is a puppet. It's a puppet regime of Putin, has already offered to build bases for the Wagner Group there. And this could be a sneak attack, onto Ukraine as another front. And we all know that the Eastern Front has stalemated because of Russian military's underwhelming performance and Ukraine's utterly lackluster counteroffensive that they've bing promising everybody for almost a year. We've given them, billions of dollars worth of equipment, it seems, and it fizzles out into a thing of steam. The Crimea is solidly Russian, and Mariupol is Russian. So both sides need a new type of initiative. So it's possible that this is all an elaborate plan. It's well within Russia's strategic culture of, they have a history of strategic sneakiness called maskirovska, as in masquerade, or unconventional war, or gray zone war, whatever you want to call it. But this is totally within their playbook. So that's one course of action. Mm-hmm. Another course of action.
Actually, not to interrupt. Has anyone in the media even asked that question?
I think it's been raised by some commentators, but the Washington consensus right now is Moscow has won this, Prigozhin, the Wagner's out, which, and it just reveals their ignorance about private warfare, about sneaky warfare. I mean, it's just, there's no evidence. It's just like, it reminds me of the CIA totally being oblivious to the end of the Cold War in 1989. It's sort of a more strategic failure from the strategic cognoscenti. So yeah, it has been raised, but not in a serious way.
Okay, next course of action.
Okay, next course of action is that Putin is he's trying to separate in his messages the leadership of the Wagner Group from the rank and file of the Wagner Group. He's trying to say, hey, Wagner Group, you're loyal Russians, lay down your arms, join the Russian army. We will give you amnesty and not kill you as traitors. And I assume what he's going to do is also honor their contract. So a Wagner contract, if you got emptied out of a jail, is this. If you can survive 6 months, you will get full amnesty and an honorable discharge if you survive 6 months. So if you're a Wagner Group guy who's survived 5 months and has 30 days to go, you may take that deal. But if you just got out of a jail last month, you have 5 more months. I mean, you are the cannon fodder for the Russian military, which is already cannon fodder. I mean, Putin has no regard for human life. So we'll see how much of Wagner Group that appeals to this deal. And meanwhile, Wagner Group is more than just Prigozhin and has several layers of leadership. They're loyal to Prigozhin mostly for paycheck. He's not like a Che Guevara or a Mandela. He's just an oligarch. He's the financier. He's the bag man. So, but that's enough, right? So one course of action is Putin, he splits the Wagner Group in half. Most of the Wagner Group join the Russian military, and then he goes after the leadership, and he either offers them a choice of arrest, exile, execution, some combination therein, right? And, if that happens, this is what might happen in response. The Wagner Group may not take the deal because they don't trust Putin. And so they may revolt. And the problem about mercenaries is that they can resist arrest, literally, which is why mercenaries are the second oldest profession. They've been around war as long as as humans have. It's only in the past 200 years that mercenaries went underground, and now they're resurrecting. And who's going to go in and arrest all those mercenaries in Belarus? The Russian military? They may get killed. The United Nations? No, they'll definitely get killed. And this is the problem of mercenaries, is that you can't arrest them, not easily. So if that happens, Putin might invoke a civil war in Russia while fighting a war in Ukraine. Right? And or if the Wagner Group decides to generally go with the Russian army, Prigozhin might go to Africa, like places like Mali or Sudan, where his best mercenaries are. His best mercenaries are not in Ukraine. They're not in Belarus. They're mostly in Africa doing other dirty work for him, and until recently, the Kremlin. And we can talk more about Africa later. But Prigozhin has options besides just, getting killed by Putin. Now, Putin could put a standing kill order on Prigozhin, but Prigozhin could put a standing kill order on Putin and stage a palace coup with his more elite Wagner Group guys. So that is on. Okay, another course of action, that's 2 courses of action. Another course of action is Putin grants general amnesty for the Wagner Group, right? But if that happens, it'll really piss off the Siloviki, like Gerasimov and Shoigu, and they might decide, maybe Putin is no longer the guy we need to lead us, and we're going to change that with a palace coup of our own, which risks another civil war, but this time from his Siloviki side. So Putin's in a box. If he's too strict against Wagner, he tempts a rebellion from then in a civil war. If he's too lenient against Wagner, the Siloviki might start a civil war, right? Either way, there's a good chance by this time next year, one or both of Prigozhin or Putin might be dead for all we know. So those are at least 3 or 4 courses of action. I do think it's possible that, today will be an indicator. How many Wagner Group guys lay down their arms and join the Siloviki side? And also Prigozhin could also just disappear into Africa and either sort of become a man with his own private army in Africa, maybe going after cobalt mines in Katanga province in the Congo, or he could stage his revenge on the Kremlin and disappear for several months and then reappear, and stage a palace coup in the Kremlin. So all these things are on the table. We should know more by close of business today. If nothing changes by close of business today, then that's also an indicator.
2 quick questions. So have you seen that Prigozhin recently met with Victor Bout?
Yeah, I've read about that. And Victor Bout's a guy I've been tracking also since the 1990s. Yeah.
Which he was, just for the audience, he was a international arms dealer that was held by the U.S. That was traded for Brittany Griner. And when I saw that news report and then saw this rebellion, I have thought, is there any way that some U.S. intelligence agency turned Victor Bout and is using him as an intermediary to deal with Prigozhin? And then the second question is the follow-up is, do you think the U.S. intelligence community is trying to flip Prigozhin in a way that will provide him, A, with a way out, and B, with a potential U.S. asset in Russia?
Okay, so Victor Bout, who's a notorious arms dealer, some of your viewers or listeners may remember the movie The Lord of War with Nicolas Cage. It's based on Bout's life. And for some background, I kind of slipped into that after him. I worked a lot in Liberia during the war period there, and I also did a lot of arms deals on the Victor Bout. I was kind of on the Victor Bout trail, flying AN-26 Cubs into parts of Africa with arms from Eastern Europe. It's interesting. So it is possible that the U.S. intel services flipped Victor Bout and made him a traitor or a double agent. It's a possibility. I don't know if he has or not, but you can't take it off the table. Or it's possible that both parties are using him as a go-between, Moscow, Prigozhin, and, that's all. Okay, so that's Victor Bout. Victor Bout, his best days are behind him. He's no longer, when he was doing all his arms trading in the 1990s, it was a very different world than today, but he still has contacts and he still has, some know-how, and he could still be active. I don't know the details, if he is active, et cetera. Now, the more interesting question is this. Remember the convoy ride to Moscow in Prigozhin's armored SUV. It's possible he had multiple cell phones in front of him that were open. One to Putin, one could have been to Zelensky, and he could have been making a deal. I mean, he's a businessman. And it's possible, another course of action is that the U.S. government, which doesn't want any fingerprints on this, may have called up Zelensky. And I wrote an op-ed about this for Newsweek in March of this year, that, the U.S. government could have said to Zelensky, hey, we'll pay through you $500 million to bribe Prigozhin and the Wagner Group off the battlefield.
Which means Prigozhin gets $50 million, but continue.
Yeah. So, why try to kill these Wagner groups? You can just bribe them off the battlefield and let the Russian weak army alone have to face the Ukrainians. That would have made for a much more successful counteroffensive. Now, when I said this in March in the Newsweek article, people thought this was fanciful. And of course, it's cheaper than all the F-16s and M1 tanks, which are fairly useless, as the counteroffensive has clearly revealed. That would have been better. So it is also, there's another course of action that, paying mercenaries to stay home is a very ancient strategy in private warfare, because in mercenary warfare, it's military strategy meets market strategy. It's like Clausewitz and World War II strategy meets what CEOs do, buying out competition, or the strategies of the souk or eBay. And our modern national security experts, the four-star generals, they don't get that on either in the Kremlin or in Washington, and that's the problem. So that's a possibility that Prigozhin was on the phone, multiple phones, trying to make a multiple deal quickly, and maybe even letting Putin know about it. It's like, here's a time limit. Here's who I'm talking to. What's your offer? So he could have done something like that. We just don't know. And nobody really knows because nobody was in that vehicle with him.
Okay. So we now know what the landscape is of what caused this, not necessarily what caused this incident, but the drivers of this incident. And we kind of know how it's been resolved, and resolved is not really the word, how it's been mitigated for now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. What are the longer term implications of this? Like, what is this illustrative of in predicting future trends that we might see with private mercenaries?
Yeah, and this is the bigger question that not enough people are asking. People are obsessed with the moment, and they're looking at the TikTok of events, and they think of it as a one-off. And it's not a one-off. I mean, again, I predicted this event, 10 years ago in my book. And I wrote a DoD, Department of Defense monograph on this type of thing in 2018. My recent speakings the last 6 months is that private warfare, mercenaries, they are coming back. They've been coming back in the shadows for 25 years. And there's nothing that will stop them. International law cannot stop them because, like I said, who's going to go into, Ukraine, Libya, Yemen, the Congo? Who's going to go in and arrest all those mercenaries? The United Nations isn't going to do it. NATO is not going to do it. The U.S. Marines are not going to do it. Mercenaries now are very lethal. They can shoot your law enforcement dead. You can rent mercenary Mi-24 Hind helicopters on the free market. For those who don't know what an Mi-24 Hind helicopter is, they are former Soviet flying tanks, essentially, and they're very lethal. And special operations forces, you can get ex-Green Berets, ex-SEALs. I mean, it's all almost everything's available. And we're getting to a point now where, in 10 or 20 years, ExxonMobil, Elon Musk, anybody who's rich can hire a private military and do whatever they want with it. We might see a future where, two mining companies hire their own militaries to take over each other's mines in Africa, especially as everybody wants these rare earth minerals that are in really difficult places like Africa. So this trend, basically the resurrection of the mercenary world, it has been ongoing for a while. Prigozhin is just the latest chapter, and the book isn't done yet. And the problem is that world governments don't see it because they are essentially state-centric. They only see things in terms of states. And they look at things that are not states as, they call it sub-state. So mercenaries, drug cartels, terrorists. And we saw how well the war on terrorism went for the United States of America. And you can look at, Mexico today, is that Mexico is really, it's narco on narco, and there are narco states, where states are prizes to be won, booty to be won in war. And that's not going to happen in the United States of America, but it's going to start happening more and more in Africa, the Middle East, parts of South Asia. It's already happening in places like that, where there will be wars without states, where the private sector will be able to wage war, because warfare is divorcing from the monogamy of just states. And this will change who has power in international relations in deeply profound ways that most foreign affairs experts today just cannot understand.
How do you recommend that the U.S. government adapt to this?
Well, the U.S. government needs to embrace a world where mercenaries are back, rather than try to A, ignore the problem, or B, assuming that they can legalize or regulate the industry. It's the time for regulation is way too late. Mm-hmm. So we need to realize, how can we surf the wave rather than try to stop the wave? And there's a couple of suggestions I have in my books. So one is you actually end up hiring a lot of these groups, and you create a regime that they'd have to follow of accountability, of transparency, of good behavior versus bad behavior, and you use market mechanisms to curb them. So contractors who do a good job get more contracts, and those who do not get bankrupt. And, the problem is that, the military industrial complex does not have a good track record of accountability, et cetera, et cetera. The other problem is, of course, is that this ultimately just furthers the mercenary market. You're not, curbing it. You're channeling parts of it. Another thing the US could do is create what I call like a foreign legion based on the French Foreign Legion. Now, when your viewers and listeners think about the French Foreign Legion, they think of mercenaries, they think of Jean-Claude Van Damme and others, but the French Foreign Legion is not that. The French Foreign Legion is a part of the French army. It is like a French army unit, but the difference is it's enlisted are from around the world. And after 20 years of service, they sign up for 5-year contracts. After 20 years of service, they get French citizenship and they get to retire in France. And that's all. And I've been suggesting for 10 years now that we should adopt a similar model. We have an American Foreign Legion. It has American officers. It only serves American interests in the United States of America, but it's enlisted from around the world, and they get U.S. citizenship. And this does a couple things. Well, first of all, we already have this visa program. Like, people can serve in our army for a couple of years and get American citizenship this way. So it's nothing new. We've been offering that for decades. The second thing is that we get the benefit of getting people who have skills, and we can use them in places that we don't want to send troops long-term to, like, maybe parts of Africa. And they can stay there and learn the local customs. And what they do, like the French Foreign Legion, is they fight the local ways. And Americans won't get too upset if dead legionnaires die, just like the French don't get too upset. So you have the accountability of a military unit, but you don't have the problems of contractors or proxy groups who are not loyal, et cetera. So it's a compromise. But ultimately, we have to get our heads around the fact that mercenaries are back, and we have to it's another, chess piece on the chessboard, and we have to learn how to play it.
Now, if the U.S. were to implement that, in the long run, how do we avoid repeating prior historical mistakes, i.e., the Germanic tribes in ancient Rome were integrated into the legions, which ultimately led to the sacking of Rome?
Yes.
Right? It's not like you had random German hordes kind of steaming in.
Yeah.
They were trained Roman legionnaire types, or at least had that experience. How do you prevent that construct?
Putin is a case study in this if he integrates the Wagner Group into the Russian army. And there's no way to prevent it, because this is a problem that goes back to the origins of using sellswords, is that it's safety and accountability. It's safety and control. Those are the two problems. And this is why after the 30 Years' War in Europe from 1618 to 1648, which saw heavy uses of mercenaries, like mercenary armies of close to 50,000 fighting each other, is that after the war, it seemed like both elites and the masses were sick of mercenaries. And from 1648 on, nation states started to invest in standing national armies for the first time in history, which are very expensive and also kind of dangerous, because standing national armies can also become a coup d'etat machine. But we don't know how and why, but we do know that nation states in Europe began to outlaw mercenaries, hence the stigma against mercenaries, and invest in their own national armies. And the height of it, starting was in the 19th century. In 1850s, all mercenaries and privateers were outlawed. Privateers are like mercenaries of the ocean. And then it starts to creep back in the 1990s. And and now we can't, this trend, which only lasted 200 years, is not going to reverse itself. So this is the problem of mercenary warfare: is control, is safety. It's what Machiavelli warns us against in his book, The Prince, in 1512. And there is no way to control it. People think they can control it, yet they get burned. But let's also not forget that it's not just mercenaries who burn their masters, it's masters who also burn their mercenaries. So people hire mercenaries and don't pay them, or they hire another mercenary group that's even larger to chase them off. I mean, there's treachery everywhere, because in a mercenary world, there is no contract enforcement, right? There's no court of law you can sue in. So it becomes like, El Paso in the 1870s, and it gets bloody. And that's what a world awash in mercenaries looks like, because mercenaries are also incentivized by profit to start and elongate wars. And they do historically. This is what they do.
All right. What about China? You don't really hear much about them. That's not to say it's not happening, but are they leveraging mercenaries anymore?
No, they're really not. So the one part of the world which is really not doing mercenaries right now is Eastern Asia. Now we're seeing mercenaries in other parts of Southeast Asia and around the extractive industry and stuff like that. But modern China has a huge, the People's Liberation Army. And here's why they're not doing it. Now, they are increasingly privatizing themselves. So what they are doing is you're seeing, they're kind of where the West was in the 1990s, where they have private security firms who are offering like logistical supply and some gate guards, but nothing like the Wagner Group or Blackwater and stuff like that. But they're kind of moving that direction. But the mercenary world doesn't also think much of Chinese mercenaries. Let me tell you why. First of all, nobody can speak their language, right? Second of all, Beijing does not allow the export of people to do this. They control, it's an autocracy. They control the movement of their people. And third of all, their military sucks. I know that there's been a lot of saber rattling, and it seems like the media, hook, line, and sinker. And the U.S. Navy loves it because it gives them more money and it gives them more staff. And, they use it on the Hill to get, ships that they don't know. So everybody plays this game. But in truth, do you know when the last time was that the Chinese army won a war?
Was it 1962 against India? I don't even know if they.
Well, that was like a firefight. Look, a real war was 1949 against they won the Chinese Civil War into nationalists. Now, the last time they launched a war was in 1980 against Vietnam. Now, think about this. The Vietnamese had, since World War II, had fought France, a superpower, kicked them out. Fought the United States, a superpower, kicked them out, went down to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, kicked their ass. And then, the million-man army of China invades, and then they kick the Chinese army. They spank them hard.
It was like in 2 weeks. It was quick.
Yeah, in 2 weeks. And, this tiny country called Vietnam, having been a whole generation at war, starving, not with good tech. And so, the truth is, beyond the saber rattling, beyond the movies like Wolf Warrior 2, we shouldn't, the mercenary world, it's the market speaking, not a bunch of analysts on Wall Street, or in DC, even worse. And the mercenary world doesn't rank, they don't rate very high in the mercenary world. So for these reasons, China doesn't get into the mercenary. They don't need to, and I don't think that they would be terribly successful in that world. Now, but they are slowly moving in that direction, and we see them using private military companies in a limited extent in Africa for the Belt Road Initiative, and we'll see how much, if that grows further.
What about the United States? I know Blackwater was big for a period of time, but seems to have gone away. I'm not sure the story behind that. There's kind of the triple canopies of the world. What's the state of the U.S. mercenary industry?
So Blackwater, Triple Canopy, DynCorp, what they did is they kind of got gobbled up into a couple. Well, Blackwater rebranded itself several times and gobbled up by something called Constellus Group, which is I don't know if it's a PE or something on Wall Street or something like that. And they kind of went out of business. That whole like industry went out of business when the US kind of left Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of those guys, went home. Some of those guys are out there as mercenaries finding new work for new clientele in places like Libya, Yemen, Africa. They're out there. I run into them in places like Papua, and a lot of them work for American extractive industry as sort of security, offensive security, what we quote unquote security. But they're still out there. The thing is that the market has changed. So when you think of Blackwater, the world of private military companies / mercenaries, that's what they are. We think of them as private military companies. The world saw them as mercenaries. Same with the Wagner Group. Moscow calls the Wagner Group a private military company. We call them mercenaries. Basically, if the skill to do one, you can do the other. Depends on market circumstance and the individual choice of people. So that world where you have these corporate, mercenary firms, the American model, that's gone away. Now, in the last 10 years, the mercenary world has gone sort of in the shadows, and they've become much more atomized, meaning that they're smaller groups that are more loosely affiliated. And it's like an illicit economy like the mafia or like narcos. And it makes them hard to track because they just put up a new shingle every time they want to do something different. But they hang out in places like Dubai or other conflict zones, or the conflict zones like, during the ISIS era, they were hanging out in Erbil, which is in sort of Kurdistan, if you will. So, they exist in places, and it's really hard to go after them. Some people say you can try to go after their clients, but their clients are states like Nigeria or Russia. Hard to go after a state, or they're huge multinational corporations or super rich individuals who are very clever at evading scrutiny of, hiding money and stuff like that. So it's easy to say and hard to do to try to go after these groups.
Now, since all this happened, or even in the last 6 months, have you ever had an opportunity to talk to some of your Wagner contacts?
Less and less. So the Wagner Group, by the way, let's talk about the Wagner Group. They are split. There's an old guard and the new guard, and they hate each other. So the old guard, they kind of came up from the 2014 Dmitry Utkin. Dmitry Utkin, who's like the real founder of it, he recruited a lot of his special forces pals, the way that Eric Prince and Blackwater recruited a lot of SEALs, or Triple Canopy recruited a lot of Delta Force guys from the Army. And that group are pretty elite, not just Russians, but like former Soviet Republic type, upper tier military folks. And they became Kremlin's like silent hand in Syria and throughout Africa. And they were pretty hardcore, not comparable to like Delta Force. We, in fact, in 2018 in Eastern Syria, about 300 Wagner Group guys stumbled into American, Delta Force. And we killed more Russians that night than any night during the Cold War. We just annihilated them. And I think Secretary of Defense Mattis at the time said, annihilate them. And so we did. And
after calling the Russians, yours?
Yeah.
Like, nope.
Well, this is the thing that mercenaries offer plausible deniability. And so the morning after we killed them all, and I talked to Wagner Group guys who were there that night, survivors. I talked to Delta Force guys there, all survivors. And it was a proper annihilation. The point is that they're pretty good, but they're not super good. But, compared to other countries, if you're in Mali or in Sudan, they're a force to be reckoned with. So meanwhile, all these old guard guys I know some of them have disappeared. I don't know if they're dead or if they just disappeared or they don't want to talk or whatever. They tried to stay out of Ukraine because they know they were cannon fodder. So they've remained doing Prigozhin's contracts around gold mines and oil mines in Africa. And meanwhile, the ex-convicts that have been dumped out of jails to, throw into the meat grinder of Ukraine, That's the New Guard. They have their own rivalry of sort of knights versus mercenaries. It's interesting to see. But yeah, the New Guard, I don't know. They're all ex-convicts. And I have not talked to them.
It's Kashim. It's Battle of Kashim.
Kashim, yeah, Kashim.
Yeah,
Battle of
way off.
And there's a Conoco gas plant out there that Wagner was trying to capture for their own use. And U.S. Special Forces there were defending for, I don't know whose use.
All right, my friend, we are at the top of the hour. So as always, I appreciate your time and expertise. It's always fascinating talking to you, and look forward to seeing you soon at some future point as soon as you can get out of the...
Yeah, thanks. Well, we'll see what happens today. Today's the deadline for the Wagner Group to either lay down their weapons and join the Russian military or face the consequences. And so maybe next time we talk, we can carry the conversation forward.
Sounds great. All right. Thank you, my friend.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sean.
If you enjoyed this video, please click on like, subscribe, and the notification button so that you're alerted time I post something new.